It's brilliant to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I do feel like a little bit of a fraud though. I was actually never very good at physics in school, so it sort of tickles my parents now that I do quite a bit of research with physicists and astrophysicists, because they were used to getting school reports saying overall pretty good, but needs to try harder in physics. So I think since school I've been trying to make up for that through space. So I do have a slide. It just touches on some of the things that I've done in terms of training and positions that I currently hold in relation to space medicine. And it's just to give you a flavor of some of the opportunities that are there. Sometimes, I'll go into what space medicine actually is, so don't worry, there'll be plenty of explanation of that. But it's just that being in Ireland, sometimes people don't realize that they can remotely access a lot of these opportunities. And it's not that I'm particularly unique in any way. It's just that as a member state, we do get these opportunities from the European Space Agency, and they are there for people to avail of. During COVID, I was very lucky to be accepted onto the European Space Agency's Space Physician Training Programme. And because it was COVID, it was conducted online, which was a bit disappointing because obviously you want to do all the centrifuges and turn people backwards and forwards and all that kind of thing. But it was handy for me because I just had a baby and she was 2 weeks old, and it would have been really, really tough to try and bring her to Cologne into the European Space Agency's processes. I got to go to the University of Texas's Principles of Aerospace Medicine training course. University of Texas Medical Branch is about to be the only remaining civilian residency program in the world for aerospace medicine, but there are a lot of fellowships that have opened up. And King's College London, I got to do their introduction to aerospace medicine as well. So I'm currently the space medicine lead for the European Society of Extreme Environments Medicine, and I'm an aviation medical examiner for the European Society. I'm a co-founder of Space Medicine Ireland, a member of the Aerospace Medicine Association and the International Aerospace Medicine Congress and International Aeronautical. And we'll talk about NASA Gene Lab down the line. So usually when I talk about space medicine, the first question is, what on earth is that? Well, at its essentials, space medicine is optimizing the health of astronauts for spaceflight. So it's operational. The idea is to mitigate against risk and to select out the healthiest people that are going to be able to perform missions in space without any medical problems or interruptions where possible. It's also rehabilitating them when they come back from space and monitoring them while they're there. And it's based on the foundation of aviation medicine and occupational medicine. So this is an incredibly brief history of how we got from A to B, basically. But if you look at the top corner there, you're looking at reconnaissance planes from World War I. And that's really when aviation medicine began. It's when things started to come together. So a lot of the developments that we see in space medicine are based on the fundamentals of military, of warfare, and of aerospace. And how they selected these pilots has really informed how we select astronauts today. So initially, there wasn't any screening of these pilots. Effectively, the people that were chosen to fly airplanes, it wasn't based on any medical standards, and we'll discuss why that was a problem. When you continue throughout history, you can see a modern jet airplane there in the top. Those start probably about 35 million US dollars and they go up to about 70 million. So if you're going to put somebody in charge of one of those and they crash it, that's a significant investment. So just for that reason alone, besides safety and medicine, the selection criteria have gotten stricter and stricter. So you'll see there's a gentleman there and he's having a look into the eye of a naval aviator. And he's doing visual tests. So some of the visual tests we do for pilots are very similar to what we do for astronauts. And there you'll see, and that's a Space Shuttle Discovery taking off. And then we have the Orion capsule, which is where we are now. So back to the start of aviation. Before the First World War, aviators weren't really professional pilots. They were enthusiasts, they were engineers, and they were sort of looked at as a bit weird and a bit out there. And there were plenty of mishaps and fatalities. But with the First World War, bombers hadn't really come in yet, so it was reconnaissance planes that they were used for. And when they picked those first pilots, they actually picked them by selecting the people that they didn't think would be very good at trench warfare. That was the rationale. You're probably not going to do very well for whatever reason in trench warfare, or maybe you were injured, maybe you had shell shock. We don't want to put you back in that situation. I know, we'll give you a plane. So very quickly after fatalities mounted and crashes, and they started losing incredible amounts of planes, they realized this is not the best way to select pilots. And the first aviation medical doctors were introduced. Flying forward then to the first astronaut selection, these are the Mercury 7, some familiar faces here, all men, all test pilots. And they really selected these individuals as the first astronauts on very strict medical, psychological criteria. And the reason they did that was, again, this was a geopolitical space race. It was America, it was Russia, and everything was very high stakes, huge amounts of money, huge amounts of publicity involved. So any problems that could occur would have been internationally embarrassing. So moving on then to the shuttle program, I'm a fan of a good schematic, so I've got a few peppered throughout the presentation, but basically the shuttle program really expanded the time spent in space. And that's really of interest to doctors, because the kinds of people that you see that were selected at Mercury 7, for example, who were astronauts, they were only expected to get to space and get back safely. So they always selected test pilots because they knew there was a significant chance that something could go wrong, these people could die, and some of them did, but also that they wanted to make sure that the vehicle was managed safely. With the shuttle program, the types of people that were chosen to fly were much, much different. So they started introducing people like doctors, scientists, teachers. And the reason for that was the mission had changed. The scope was bigger. The capsule that people were in were larger. They could take more people, and the mission had changed in terms of duration as well. So then they used the space shuttle to build the International Space Station, piece by piece. In the shuttle hold there, so there's quite a big item, I suppose, there in the carrier hold, the Canada arm. So what they did was actually they transported it up piece by piece, section by section, and then assembled it in flight. That's the International Space Station today. And at the moment, there are several astronauts still in orbit at the moment, including 2 who should have been home quite a bit of time ago, but are still there. So this is one, I suppose, the most impressive technical achievement of humanity. And it's about the size of a 6-bedroom house. And if you have 10 or 15 individuals living in the 6-bedroom house, these days you're there for about 6 months. Sometimes people are there for a year, and it's obviously a confined space. You can't go for a walk, you can't open a window. So that requires a different mentality than you would see in terms of the early programs. So the psychological screening has become increasingly important when you select those people. You also start having to select for things like, can I live with this person in a confined space for 6 months and not want to choke them? Which is not something that necessarily you would have had to consider previously. So it's an incredibly complex array, and it's about to be wound down, actually. And we'll talk about the next steps after ISS. But it's also fairly old tech. So the shuttle program ran for nearly 20 years, but it finished up in the 2010s. And a lot of the technology that was used to build it is 15 and 20 years old, just because of, I suppose, how space agencies actually commission work and how long it takes to get built and so on. Most of us don't have cars old enough to be on the International Space Station. So a lot of the tech is in need of constant repair as well, which takes up a bit of time for the astronauts. So what I want to talk about this evening then is, in that context, the space hazards for human health. Space isn't good for you. We're not designed to function in space. We evolved over a very long, very slow period of time to function optimally in 1G, this gravitational level. So once you go into microgravity or you experience different forces on the body, it does funny things in lots of different ways, okay? It causes fluid shifts. Gravity pulls your fluid in your body, or mostly fluid component, down to your legs In space, that doesn't happen. So all that fluid backs up, and we'll have some pictures of what that looks like. It increases your risk of kidney stones. You're exposed to significant amounts of radiation the farther you go from Earth. We'll talk about that. You get motion sickness. Sadly, the people who get space sickness are not the same people necessarily who get motion sickness on Earth, so it's hard to predict. It affects your sleep. You have a sunrise and sunset approximately every 45 minutes on the International Space Station. So if you're somebody that likes a nice dark sleeping situation, you're not a great sleeper, it's not a great place to be. It's a loud place as well. I talked about that machinery being quite old, a lot of it, and it's running 24 hours a day, life support, water filtration, air filtration, all of those systems, they're old, they're rattly, and they're noisy. So you're dealing with a lot of difficult components that are kind of affecting you psychologically. And astronauts are busy. So they have a phrase that astronauts use called chasing the red line. So they have a workflow every day. Everyone thinks that they're stressed in work. Nobody has seen what an astronaut's schedule looks like. It is absolutely jam-packed with science experiments, with different criteria that they have to meet every day. And they're constantly trying to chase this red line that tells them where they are in relation to the time and how far behind they are, and then how long they have to catch up. So they're under a lot of psychological pressure, and they're also having researchers on the ground who maybe have been working towards this experiment in space for 10 years. Their whole research lab is behind it, or maybe a company has spent, I don't know, 20 million, 30 million euros to put that up into space. So they're under a lot of pressure to deliver results. So we'll talk about muscles and bones, but first we're going to talk a little bit about radiation. And it depends where you are, what kinds of radiation you're exposed to. This is a slide from the European Space Agency. So while you're sitting there in your seats at the moment, you are being irradiated. Right now. Everybody is, so am I. We're all exposed to background radiation all day, every day, in varying quantities. It's so low in terms of the dosage that's unlikely to be significant for your health, but we are constantly exposed to radiation. If you fly, that radiation level exposure goes up. If you fly internationally or between continents, it goes up again. Or if you're flying over the poles, it goes up again. Once you get to the International Space Station, you are exposed to different kinds of radiation. You're exposed to solar flares. You're exposed to background radiation in the cosmos. But there's still some level of protection within the Van Allen belts. When we're going back to the moon, which is the plan from NASA, ESA, and JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, or onto Mars, there is a huge increase in the amount of radiation that you're going to be exposed to. And it quantifies one of the unknown unknowns. And it's very difficult to know how that's going to be mitigated against. And there's entire working groups at NASA working on that problem at the moment. So if you're on the ISS, you're exposed to about 250 times your exposure sitting here. And if you're there for a year, that's not insignificant. So the space agencies have a lifetime maximum of radiation that you can be exposed to. And the main reason that they do that is because of the risk of cancer. That's a big concern. This is the Russian Soyuz capsule. Does it look really comfortable? No, wouldn't want to spend too much time there. So it's a transport vehicle, hasn't changed much since the 60s or 70s, but does what it says in the tin, gets you up, gets you down, has a low failure rate. But it hits the ground with a fair bang. So if you've been in space for a long period of time and your muscles and your bones are a little bit atrophied, a little bit smaller than they should be, a little bit thinner than they should be, this packs a bigger whack than you would think. So if you ever see astronauts coming down or being interviewed or being taken or wheelchaired out after they do land, some of it is from that acceleration force that they are subjected to. Anybody know who this is? You're nearly right. It's Scott Kelly. It's his brother. Yeah. But I'm glad you said that, actually, because they are identical twins. So that's quite reasonable. And they're both astronauts. So it's very reasonable that you would think that that is Scott. The difference between Scott and Mark Kelly is that Scott spent a year in space and Mark spent a year on the ground. So NASA did this twin study recently because there's so many changes that happen in spaceflight. And we've only been sending people up to the International Space Station for longer than a week, basically, for a decade or so. So we have absolutely no idea what the long-term DNA changes, physiological changes do to your long-term risk of so many things. So they thought, you know what we'll do? We'll find two top quality identical twins who are both capable of being astronauts. We'll recruit them both and not tell them why. And then when they're through the astronaut training, we'll send one of them to space for a year, and then we'll analyze their DNA, their blood, their urine, their bone samples, and we'll publish loads of papers about it. Thankfully, they were both up for the task and delighted with the opportunity, because most of your DNA is the same if you're identical twins. And I say most because there are epigenetic changes that happen to DNA throughout your life when you have different experiences, different stressors, and so on. They're subtle, but they're there. And they tested them when they came back. They've been poked and prodded so much in their lives. But what they did find was some really interesting things. And some of those form part of the NASA Gene Lab open science research that's going on at the moment. And people can get involved in that from wherever they are in the world. They don't have to work for NASA. And it's one of the areas we're really interested in here in Ireland. One of the things that they found when they looked at Scott Kelly's DNA when he came back from a year in space versus Mark's, they did samples before they left and then after when he came back. And they discovered that his telomeres had elongated. They'd gotten longer. So telomeres are sort of I call them the bumpers at the end of your chromosomes. So they're sort of the protective sheath at the end of a chromosome. There's a little bit of DNA in there, a little bit of protein, a few other things. And they're connected to aging and they're connected to general health. They're not fully understood in their long-term role. And they kind of thought, when you're subjected to certain stressors, periods of starvation, malnutrition, and so on, in some cases your telomeres get shorter. So they wondered if we put somebody in space for that long, would their telomeres get shorter? And they didn't, they got longer. So this often happens in spaceflight. What we expect to happen with a stressor, the literal opposite happens. And that's confusing because we have no idea why that happens. And it's probably concerning too. But then they tested him again. They took another DNA sample 4 months later. And some of the changes had reversed and some of the others hadn't. So they did it after a year. And they found again that some of the changes had reversed and some of them hadn't. So where does that leave us? It means that we don't know what the long-term DNA genome level effects are of long-term spaceflight. So when we're looking at sending people to Mars, which is, you know, a 3-year there and back pretty much, at a minimum, that's a big difference. If you're sending people with the potential to have children, so you're sending people of childbearing years before they hit menopause, particularly for women, they could pass that DNA on with those changes. Is that a problem? We don't know. So it just kind of opens the kind of barrel of worms of there are so many unknowns in this situation. So just to kind of give a sense of where this is all going and why it's increasingly important that we understand these things. Artemis missions, back to the moon. This is the plan. This is what the agencies have signed up for. This is what they have signed all their agreements to do over the next decade. Artemis 1 has already flown, but that was an uncrewed mission. The second mission is Artemis 2. That's going to happen in Q4, so end of next year, 2025. Whether that deadline will be met or not, it's anyone's guess, but that's the aim. And that's going to be a crewed mission. That's not going to land on the moon. That is going to test the Orion capsule, do some experiments and check the flight path, but it's not going to land. Artemis 3 is going to land back on the moon, and the target site at the moment is the lunar South Pole. So this is the plan from NASA, European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency. Chinese and the Russians have their own plan in a similar site, but not at the South Pole. And those locations have been chosen for various reasons, trajectory, some craters that look like they may have held water at some point, unsure. But there's a few different criteria that they have selected. And then this is the next planned station for the moon in low lunar orbit. This is called the Gateway Station. And the idea behind this, would this be a port or a staging post for Mars missions, but also for, say, mining crews on the moon. So this is an advanced stage of development, and the European Space Agency has already, has already committed to providing components for this. So there are going to be at least 2 European components. One of them is going to be called the EnviHab, which is going to be kind of primary living space, and the European support module. The Americans are going to be providing the bulk of it, and the Japanese Space Agency are providing some of the technical support. And if you see that protracted levered arm that's hanging out, that's Canada Arm 2. So that the original one was on the space shuttle, and the Canadian Space Agency have designed an upgraded version of that to fit everything together. So back to medicine. This is Dr. Serena Anand Chancellor. I was very lucky to be instructed by her as part of my University of Texas medical branch training. And she has flown twice to space and done 2 6-month missions. And this is her doing, basically looking at the back of the eye and taking photographs of it and sending it down to flight surgeons who are medical doctors on the ground. So one of the things that happens in spaceflight is this fluid shift that we mentioned already. And what it does is sort of strange. It gives you what's called puffy face chicken legs, and we're going to have a look at that in a while. But your legs, because of that fluid going upwards, it's not being pulled down by gravity, it's just being allowed to sit wherever it sits. It goes upwards from where it's normally sitting. So your legs get thinner looking just because of that fluid shift. Your kidneys, which manage your fluid supply and regulate it, have to adapt. Puts you at increased risk of kidney stones. But what it really essentially does as well, the fluid backs up into the back of your eye. So your skull is a box, it's a closed space. So if you get too much fluid build up or bleeding inside your skull, it damages the only soft thing that's in there, which is your brain, which obviously we do not want. The brain is also obviously exposed to radiation in spaceflight, which again, we do not want. But what's really interesting is there's a new medical condition that affects astronauts that's never been seen on Earth. And it's called spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. And they think it's because of this fluid shift at the back of the eye that puts pressure on the optic nerve, which is goes through a tiny little hole into the back of the eyeball. But it's not fully understood. And again, this is being researched. You have 2 Japanese astronauts there who are taking blood samples and doing experiments. Sadly, all astronauts are poked and prodded more than they would like, but they're all trained in basic medical skills to manage things there. So the problem is that space is very unfortunately trying to kill you the entire time that you're there. Obviously, if you're exposed to the vacuum of space for any period of time, your survival will be measured in seconds and minutes. But even within ISS, you know, if there was a fire, if there was a significant leak, or if they were hit, increasingly likely, by space debris of even a small few, you know, a centimeter, a paint chip or something like that came off an old satellite. There's plenty of that moving around above us. It's extremely dangerous, so we have to always have that in mind. So back to our friend, the unhappy astronaut. So he's got his fluid redistributed from his legs up into his head, very unpleasant. And his vestibular system is acting up. The vestibular system, which we'll have a look at, is really the inner ear, and it tells you where is up and where is down, and that stops making sense in spaceflight. So that's one of the things that contributes to space sickness. We talked about kidney stones. Kidney stones are an excruciatingly painful thing. They tend to mainly affect men because the connection between their peeing orifice and their kidneys is longer. Basically, it's got farther to travel, so stones have got, you know, an easier place to back up. But it tends to be very, very, very difficult to deal with because it's so painful. And that's a problem, because if you're incapacitated and you're in charge of a vehicle through pain, that's extremely dangerous for everyone around you, particularly if you're the pilot trying to get a module down. That's a problem. So this in the middle is Jessica Meir and two other astronauts. So they're floating in microgravity. That's in the ISS. What you might notice is that there's quite a bit of technical equipment, lots of wires and everything all around them. And that makes things very difficult. Can you see? It might not be that easy to see. There's all these bars here. Can you see those? Yeah, down at the bottom of the screen. And those are tow holes, okay? When people are getting used to microgravity, they have to kind of hold on to things to move around the cabin, because if they launch themselves in a direction, and they have that momentum. They just keep going. There's nothing to stop them. They don't fall down. The same goes if you sneeze, you know, it doesn't go down. It just goes directly towards the person you're talking to. So you have to be very careful. Once you put anything in motion, it just continues along that trajectory until it hits something. So what they do is they use these hand and footholds predominantly because it leaves their hands free to work, because they don't get a lot of time to adapt once they get up there, and they have to start working pretty quickly. Daniel Tanney, who's a NASA astronaut, was in Dublin there a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that the biggest thing that he noticed health-wise when he came back from space was actually nothing to do with his vision. He didn't have blurred vision, didn't have any kidney stones, nothing like that. But he said it was the weirdest thing. The soles of his feet were soft like a baby's because he hadn't walked. You know, he hadn't actually put pressure on his feet in 6 or 8 months. But the top of his feet was gnarled, it was bruised, it was cut, it was covered in scabs and all this kind of thing, because he was using them to maneuver all around and holding onto them so he wouldn't float away while he was working. And I thought that was really interesting. It's not something that we've ever thought about or heard before. So the main focus that I'd like to talk about tonight is really about your bones. Now, you'll notice that this is a picture of bones. This is a picture of muscles. Why am I talking about muscles first? Well, bones are a living tissue. They're not a fixed structure. They move, and they're moved on by muscles. They need that. You need that stimulus from muscles lifting, working, having gravity acted on them to maintain their density and to maintain their strength and their integrity. What happens to all these muscles in space? They're not being used in the same way, and you get something called skeletal unloading, okay? And that's a big problem for your bones. So, here's the bone. This is the head of your femur. Everybody here hopefully has two. And that's where they're located in the body, okay? And you have a lot of different muscle groups that attach to your femur. The reason I'm singling this one out is these are some of the biggest, strongest bones in the body. So it's where we use measurements on bone density because they tend to be fairly accurate. And if you're having problems here, then you're definitely having problems in your smaller bones, like your spinal processes and so on. So it's a really good place. This is a post-mortem sample. And you know, obviously there'd be a capsule, the hip joint and everything, and lots of blood vessels and so on. And this is the neck of your femur. When you hear about somebody breaking their hip, normally what happens is they've actually broken their femur. So we'll discuss how this works. So this is a plain film X-ray, and you'll notice that there's a little line marked there at the head of the femur, and that is not the same on the other side. So this one is nice and intact, and sadly, the other one is broken, okay? So hip fractures is something we see in Ireland quite a lot. We have a huge rate of osteoporosis in the country. We have a huge rate of osteopenia, which is the step before osteoporosis. And if you have weaker bones and you fall, you are very likely to break your hip. Why do we really care about people breaking their hip? Well, it's incapacitating. You're off your feet for a prolonged period of time. If you're elderly, it can really affect your mobility, your independence going forward. But the death rate actually after a hip fracture is huge. So depending on your circumstances, you know, in the 12 months after you have a hip fracture, you know, there's up to a third risk of subsequent death after that, which is absolutely enormous and really concerning. So this is a DEXA scan result. I know that there's at least one GP in the audience who know would be sick to death looking at these. But this is a way, it's a specialized type of X-ray that basically has a look at your bone density. And it tells you how dense your bones are, whether they're in a healthy range or whether they're a little bit thinner than they should be, osteopenia, like we said, or whether they've gone really, really, really thin and they've gone to osteoporosis, which is where we get very, very concerned about them. So astronauts have to have a DEXA scan done before they fly, and then every 3 years while they're in the astronaut corps. At the moment, NASA at least offers all former astronauts an annual medical. So they can go down to Houston and they can meet with a flight surgeon, they can meet with somebody there, primary care doctor, and emergency care, and all of that's available to them. And they scan them, they do a DEXA scan, they do lots and lots of tests just to make sure that they're still healthy and well. So they offer them that on a lifelong basis, no matter when they left the astronaut corps, no matter when they flew. Not all astronauts avail of it. Some do. Quite a large proportion do. Of the ones that do avail of it, they have the option of opting in or opting out to a data set, of allowing their medical data anonymized to be used for study. And a lot of that data is being used by researchers in universities in Ireland now. So this is Paolo. He is an Italian student who's been paid a reasonable amount of money to lie in bed for 60 days in Toulouse in France. Sounds great. Great job. Who'd want to do that? Does anyone really enjoy being paid to lie in bed for 60 days? Yeah? It's got a hand up. Great. Okay, fantastic. Might this be a problem? He can't get up. So this is a research study called a bed rest study, and it's one of the spaceflight analogues. It's one of the medical ones. So CNES, the French space agency, and the DLR, which is the German Research Institute, run a lot of these. Only up to 60 days. They haven't been able to get medical ethics to do it any longer than that, because it's actually quite debilitating. This is to facilitate that same skeletal unloading that you get in spaceflight. So they take little bone samples and little muscle samples as well, and they do analysis as people go through. And you will already see loss at the 60-day mark, which is astonishing. It's very variable between individuals, ages, genders, same as it is for astronauts, but there is still bone and muscle loss. When astronauts are in space, they lose bone about 1% a month at a maximum. Sometimes 0.5%. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you've only got a certain amount of bone, right? It stops at 100. So that's actually a huge amount. When you look at postmenopausal women in this country, I mean, you're looking at a much lower rate of loss, and they're probably our highest risk group, although men also, and people who've been treated with radiation. So what's the solution? Weights. So some people are really good at weight-bearing exercise. Some people are not. Women statistically do less weight-bearing exercise than men, and they tend not to maintain it throughout their lives, even if they do it initially. So when I do GP consultations with older women who are at risk of fractures or risk of osteoporosis, I always ask them if they lift weights, and they laugh at me. And they're like, yeah, sure, you know, I'm 90, what would I be doing in the gym lifting weights? And I say to them, any weight whatsoever will be good for your bones and reduce your fracture risk. I'm not talking about going to the gym. I'm talking about half a kilo weight at home, or a 500 ml bottle of water, or anything you have in your kitchen, a small milk, whatever it is, lift it over your head. Because it's only through that process of getting your muscles to work on your bones over and over on a regular basis that you maintain their density. And it's really, really tough. These little soft fellas, I don't know, ignore the brand on them, but they have these little soft wraparound weights of about half kilo, and you can get them bigger as well. But they're fantastic for people who maybe don't have great balance. Older people may not have great balance, or they may not do a lot of walking, but they're sitting in the chair, and they're still at risk of hip fractures if they're transferring, you know, from bed into the kitchen or whatever it is, whatever small amount of walking they do. And they can sit, and they can lift the leg, and they can still load those muscles, and they can still maintain that bone density. So that's really important. The other thing that all astronauts will get supplemented on, and something that we've got a particular problem with in Ireland, is vitamin D. So calcium is a really important building block for bone. Most people, I think, would know that. But vitamin D is really, really important as well, okay, to facilitate that transfer and that build-up and maintain it. Vitamin D comes from the sun, also comes from fortified foods in the diet and certain other sources, but in Ireland we don't get a lot of sun, very sadly. So we do recommend most people take a vitamin D supplement if they're not already doing so. And that's mainly for your bones. So this is the same lady in both pictures. And these photographs are just a few weeks apart. Would you recognize her as the same person immediately? Probably not. So we talked about that fluid shift. So this is the puffy face element of the fluid shift. And you can just see that all of her features are not as well defined. And particularly around the eyes and the chin, you can see that that has changed quite a bit. And that's when the fluid backs up. And that's the same for other astronauts as well. But I just thought this example demonstrated it. So we talked about the fluid volume. I mean, it's really, initial is the biggest shift. So you really will have up to kind of a 2-litre bottle of Coke level of fluid moving from your legs upward. That's really disorienting. And that's a big problem. It tends to kind of calm down as your kidneys learn to regulate it over time. But there still will be a certain amount of fluid shift, and you still will maintain a little bit of that puffiness and that disability looking. Yeah. So the other thing about the fluid shift that's interesting is the fact that your fluid gets regulated by your kidneys. So your kidneys have learned to do it and learned to manage it. But the way that they learn to manage it is by a process called diuresis, which means that you pee a lot more. So you're not hanging on to that fluid. So you have less circulating volume, which means if you start bleeding, there's less there. So that's a problem. But the other thing about it is that you start breaking down your red blood cells. And they're not exactly sure why this happens, but it leads to a condition called anemia. And there is a specific spaceflight anemia, okay? If you are profoundly anemic, you will feel short of breath, you'll feel lightheaded, you might even collapse. Now, that doesn't tend to happen to astronauts because their baseline health is so high, but you do start breaking down much more red blood cells in space than you would here on Earth. You do break a certain amount down anyway, and it really accelerates during spaceflight. So this is Christopher Hadfield. He's Canadian, but he has a particular affinity for Ireland. He visits here a lot, and he played David Bowie's Space Oddity in space, and he also spoke some Irish in space, so he's probably one of the better known astronauts. I just put this up because it shows you kind of the disorienting perspective. You know, there is no up, there is no down, and it's quite difficult to kind of keep track of where you are. Particularly, this is the cupola. I don't know if people are familiar with that. The cupola is a viewing area. If you see beautiful photographs of Ireland, of Dublin, of different parts of Europe that are taken from space, that's where they were taken from. And the astronauts all compete with each other to try and take good photographs from it. And it's quite tricky because obviously they're moving at speed, so they tend to get a lot of blur. And apparently there's only one type of camera up there. I won't say a brand in case anyone gets annoyed, but this is not popular universally. So if you don't know where up is or where down is, this can make you feel unwell, can make you feel space sick. And that's a problem if you're trying to do any safety critical tasks. So on Earth, you have a lot of different sensory inputs that will tell you where up is and where down is. And they're pretty reliable generally. If anyone's ever been quite drunk or been shook around in a centrifuge or been on a roller coaster that's gone just a little bit too fast for you, you will have sometimes those motions where those sensors are not quite sure if they're correct or not until you can settle and get all the inputs together. So your vision, so when you're looking around, it's very clear, getting all these inputs telling you, yes, my feet are on the ground, they're exactly where they're supposed to be, that's where up is. You're also getting sensory inputs from your vestibular system in your inner ear that we mentioned. But you've got haptic sensors, you've got touch sensors, you know, in your feet, in your limbs to tell you, yes, you're in the right place. And all of these agree with each other. Your muscles also tell you exactly in terms of position where you are. So that's all very reassuring. But once you go to space, all those inputs, they're not agreeing with each other. And it's that disagreement that makes you feel unwell. So this is a picture of your ear from the outside in your pinna all the way into the inner ear. And you can see that there's these little areas here, these semicircular canals. It looks a bit like a snail shell upside down. And inside of those, you've got really highly specialized little cells called hair cells. And they are really what tell you where up is, okay? And if you ever move your head, anyone suffer from vertigo or anything like that, it's where you're moving your head in a direction and your hair cells are getting confused. That can happen for lots of different reasons, but they are great position indicators and sense of body position indicators. So if you're moving your head up and down too fast, you start to feel a bit wobbly, your hair cells are a bit overstimulated. They also are very sensitive to damage, and they can get damaged very badly by noise exposure. So you will see a lot of pilots who, or aircraft technicians and things like that who don't wear safety gear or maybe don't wear their hearing protection. And they often get what's called tinnitus, just ringing in their ears. Astronauts can get that too. And the problem is that once that process starts, it does tend to get worse with repeated noise exposure. There's very little we can do medically to treat it. Once these cells are damaged, they tend to continue to get worse. That's a huge problem. So why am I talking about all of this in Ireland? There are so many researchers in this country who are working on various aspects of space. Physicists, astrophysicists, aeronautical engineers. The French Space Agency recently, on behalf of ESA, launched an Ariane rocket from French Guiana. The cameras on that rocket, which are now space certified, were made by a company in Coolock and called Railtra. So we are all over space, which is fantastic. It's great to see it. But in terms of space medicine research, that's also true. We have dental researchers, we have defense researchers, we have musculoskeletal researchers, and those outputs are everywhere. And the great thing is that ESA offers training from the secondary school level to university to postgraduates, and a lot of it's online, some of it's in person, but it's all free. So you can go, you can sign up, you can apply on ESA's website. You don't have to be a technical expert, and it's really digestible. So if anyone's interested in that area, I really would strongly ask them to consider it. ESA also does a lot of climate, humanitarian tracking, satellite work as well. And they're involved in the Copernicus project, which again looks at marine data on a grand scale. And it really has a lot of applications. Loads of it is just freely available online, and you can do your own research if you're interested. So one of the last things I want to talk about, just very briefly, are space analogs. So we talked about the bed rest studies, which are one particular type of space analog, and these are just a couple of others. So up here on top, I've got Tim Peake, who is a British astronaut, and he is in a cave. So spelunking or caving is something that the European Space Agency does with all of its astronauts in teams, the same teams that they're going to deploy with to space. And why do they do that? Well, caving is actually a very good analog for spaceflight in that it's dangerous. You can't fake risk, so you do have to expose people to it. You know, they're aware, their physical responses, their psychological responses are real. You get them to work in a team, so any kind of interpersonal difficulties come to the fore when you put people under pressure. Caves are uncomfortable, they're dark, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of danger, and there's poor communication. It's actually very hard to get communication with them as well. So it's a really good analog, so that's why they use it there. And then just underneath there, you'll see that funny looking kind of dome thing. It's about the size of a 2-bedroom house. That's called the Hera mission. It's a NASA mission. And it's, yeah, two up, 2 down in town here, sort of house. And they put 3 or 4 astronauts in that, and they keep them there for a year. That's in Utah. Why do they do that on Earth? Psychologically, that's a big thing. They can't leave. Food and water is brought to them. They can't see their friends except for video calls, families, and so on. So human factors teams spend an awful lot of time studying and training with the people who go through these missions because it is such an intense psychological process, and they really, really screen for them. I obviously applied to the European Space Agency's astronaut selection 2 years ago now and was soundly rejected, along with 21,898 other people. So don't feel too bad. There are 192 Irish people applied, and I think I know 80 of them, which just shows you how small the space community is at the moment. So we need more people if anyone's interested. But it just shows you like the scale of interest, which is great across Europe. But when people who I know who got farther in the process went for the interviews in Cologne, what I found really interesting was they were talking about the tasks they were assigned in teams and, you know, being able to lead, but being able to follow. But they were being walked around constantly by doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists who were constantly there clipboarding and making notes about not just the decisions they made and how they fulfilled the task, but how they talked to people, how they responded to criticism, how they dealt with time pressures, how they dealt with people, you know, following them around. It was really interesting. So the psychological testing was a huge element, and the HERA study is one of the most interesting ones that they do, because who on earth would volunteer to be there in a box in Utah for a year? It sounds absolutely miserable. if you're interested in this area and it's something that you think, gosh, you know, I don't really want to get involved in it, but I'd like to know a little bit more, asma.org is probably the best one. It's the Aerospace Medical Association's website, and they have the history of aviation medicine. They have great resources on up-to-date studies and things like that, and they've got lots of good videos. The European Space Agency website is there as well, ESA.org or ESA.int, and they also have a huge amount of material there, but I find that the American stuff, there's a lot more pictures, so sometimes people like that. Perfect. And then the Irish Space Association, which is primarily engineers, but has recently expanded to include space medics, and it's run by Dr. Patricia Moore. They have their website there, and they run a lot of events from cybersecurity to satellites to engineering. So if you're interested, there's lots there. So thank you very much. We'll take any questions. Happy to take questions if anyone has them. Don't feel under any pressure if you'd rather not. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. You covered a lot of material there during the short lecture. I just want to say, of the roughly 200 types of cancer that the average human body can get, which ones do you think would be the most prevalent up in space as well? And secondly, following on from that, for possible future Moon or Mars missions, how realistic would be a kind of a container you do a shield against solar flares and solar prominences and increased cosmic radiation for the sun that would cause increased radiation risk for astronauts and long-term missions, like for a future Moon or Mars mission, please?
Great, thanks very much. So in terms of the radiation exposure for flight at the moment, what they're most worried about are your most radiosensitive organs. So for women, that's your ovaries, your thyroid for men and women, and then the gonads, so the testes as well. So those are the areas that are most radiosensitive. And it also means that because they're sending people up who tend to be in the prime of life, who may have children afterwards, they're especially concerned about childbearing potential. So that's a huge issue. When you look at the countermeasures for radiation, there's an enormous amount of work going on with this, which is great. But it's very unpredictable because the radiation exposure is very up and down. It's not a consistent level that you can plan for. It's very hard to know that your countermeasures are definitely going to mitigate against it until you're exposed to it. At the moment, there are areas like the capsules that are a bit more shielded in terms they've got a lot more material in terms of the outer exposures that are on the space station, so that the astronauts can retreat to that if NASA or ESA sees that there's a lot of solar flare activity that's happening. And they also try to, if in terms of launches and returns, they try to take that into factor, in their planning. When they're looking at Mars, so one of the proposed countermeasures for radiation in particular has been water shielding. So using water as a diffuser of certain kinds of radiation and incorporating that into some of the inflatable parts of the station and so on. So one of the newer commercial stations that is in planning at the moment and hopefully will be launched in the next 5 to 10 years, is looking at that certainly as a potential countermeasure. But again, it's very hard to predict because the exposure level is so unpredictable, sadly. Thank you.
I should preface this by saying I don't know anything about this. But what's the obvious reason why they don't, within the ISS, they don't have a kind of weak layer of magnet kind of as a track for the floor, so to kind of combat osteoporosis type, the lack of muscle workout and maybe vestibular issues as well, just to kind of ground and orient yourself, also work the muscles.
Yeah. So one of the things that I probably should have put in this presentation is some of the what we call ARED, Advanced Resistive Exercise Devices. So it sort of looks like a treadmill, but you're strapped into it because obviously if you're going to run, you will drift off in the other direction because you're putting downward force, which then will be reflected back. So they do have exercise devices that are strapped in. That is something that you can do. In terms of the magnetic element, not a quick fix. And the problem with magnets and anything that you send up there is that you've got so much other technical equipment that those magnets could then potentially interfere with. For example, in terms of imaging modalities, so obviously in medicine, we would use ultrasound, we would use X-ray, we would use CT, we would use MRI. At the moment, ultrasound is the only one that's used on ISS because of the complexity of, say, for magnets for MRI. Now, it's something that's being considered. It's also quite bulky. In terms of radiation, for the other ones, they wouldn't be considered. But if you're having, say, a magnetic track down one area, it's not as straightforward as that, because nothing is on the floor or on the ceiling. It's all just work and usable space. So there isn't exactly a through way of doing it. And also, if you're kind of restricted towards one element, you're not going to be able to use the 360 degrees of the other elements. So it's not a bad idea, but for logistical reasons, probably wouldn't be definitive.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Do the epigenetic changes that the astronauts face follow a certain pattern, or are they completely random?
Good question. We don't know definitively, is the short answer. Because there's so little data, and it's from such a narrow range of people, usually from a certain gender, a certain age group, and over a certain period of time, it's not reflective of people in general, and a certain health status as well. What I would say is the epigenetic changes that have been determined already, most of the data that they have is from mouse models. So there have been mice on the International Space Station in a research capacity for nearly 20 years. So they do actually have a lot of data from them, and what they show specific patterns. So sometimes they're consistent, but there are outliers all the time. It's not straightforward, because people live a lot longer, and our DNA is quite different in a lot of ways, not all of it, but sufficiently different, that they're not immediately, the results are not immediately transferable. It means it's hard to say if that's works for us, what works for them. What I would say is that even with muscle and bone loss, like it's very variable from one astronaut to another. You and I could both go to ISS for a year. You might lose huge proportion of your bone density, and I might lose very little. And they don't exactly know why that is. And one of the reasons they're looking at is around DNA, and it's around coding for osteoblasts, which are your build-up bone cells, and osteoclasts, which are your resorbing cells. But again, it's not directly straightforward, sadly. It's hard to predict. Yeah.
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. In terms of like equivalent altitude, is there sort of a certain pressure and oxygen saturation that they maintain the space station at? And is that, like, say if you go to high altitude, it tends to encourage red blood cell production, whereas the opposite seems to be happening there. So have they looked at sort of ways to like mitigate the anemia, like with diet or adjusting oxygen saturation, and has it made any difference?
So they have looked at it, and so far it hasn't made any difference, okay? So, I mean, when you're looking at pressurization, for example, in an aircraft, it's a very different situation because you've got total control of that environment. And you do have, obviously, I mean, it is pressurized to a point, and they do maintain minimum oxygen saturations. I mean, normally you have 21% oxygen saturation here at 1G at baseline, and obviously that decreases as you go to altitude. You don't get the kind of sensations of altitude, like altitude sickness. You don't get the same progression, you know, into very serious conditions that you can get, like, you know, altitude associated, like pulmonary edema, cerebral edema. So you get fluid in your lungs, fluid in your brain. You don't get those same physiological parameters change at spaceflight. So it tends to be totally different ones. And it's really difficult then because you can't take data from altitude and then directly apply it to space. And we're working on a project at the moment. I'm supervising medical students, and they did brilliant work looking through loads of papers on like altitude sickness and all this kind of stuff. And I'm saying, like, unfortunately, like, it's such a different environment that really there's not a lot of applicability for a lot of the stuff we know for altitude. Although having said that, when you look at jet pilots who are pulling serious G forces, you know, they're wearing their G suits and so on, to try and mitigate that force, because obviously when you go into space, you're experiencing force in 3 directions, and you can only tolerate a certain amount of force particularly in the downward direction. So if you're experiencing a lot of force from your head to your toes, that's same for pilots and same for astronauts, you'll lose consciousness fairly quickly because your body's not designed to cope with it. And it's one of the reasons when you look at the space shuttle, you look at how it launched, it would launch directly up and it would land like a plane. But when you look at how the astronauts were seated, they were seated in like a semi-recumbent position. So they were sitting down and lying on their backs. So when you see that climbing tower and they get into the rocket, they walk all the way up the tower, they get in, they suit down, and they get into like a lying back on their backs. And that's how they launch, because all of the force then, or not all of it, but a significant proportion of that force goes this way. So it goes through the chest. Now, it's not comfortable, described as an elephant sitting on your chest, but it is tolerable for those few seconds of that intense upward motion. Whereas if they were going this direction and the force is all being transmitted through their head, they would be unconscious and in very big trouble very quickly. But sadly, we can't have those applicability from altitude sickness. The other thing is that the CO2, obviously, people know that if you have too much CO2, again, it makes you unwell and you can lose consciousness. There is generally a higher proportion of CO2 in the International Space Station, and they often use more nitrogen as well in the air to try and I suppose maintain the mix as well, because if you have too much oxygen, oxygen promotes fire, it'll get a little spark. That's a very dangerous situation. It's quite tricky. But because of their sort of the air purification and the cleaning circuit and all of that, because it's a closed system, it's quite tricky to maintain as well. And like recently they had a situation where they'd noticed that a smell had developed and they were all sort of going around looking for the source of the smell, which sounds like a small thing, but like, you know, all of your air circulation, everything your survival depends on is old machinery around you. And they discovered that there was quite a lot of growth of microbial life. So, you know, little bacteria, mold, basically behind the toilet. And like that's a problem because that's all circulating, you know. So they wrapped it up in sample containers and they sent it back to NASA, who spent a long time in petri dishes and analyzing it and found all sorts of things, and analyzed how the bacteria behaved then in spaceflight and such as well. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, thanks. Just on the toilet, probably last comment for me. But what is quite interesting is obviously, you know, it is a closed system. So, you know, you do need to take that fluid that is produced by the astronauts in their urine and reuse that. And when I do talks to kids, they're always like, well, what? You're drinking wee? It's like, yes, you're drinking wee, but you're not just drinking wee, you're drinking highly filtered, sterilized, you know, more appetizing, I suppose, wee. But also you're drinking the wee of everyone that you work and live with. So that's not great. Obviously, solid waste goes in the other pipe. So that all goes down to earth and is incinerated. So that's fine. Any last questions after all that?
Yeah, what's your view like, given that amount of complexity to keep pure human body in the outer space, and the development of the technology and all the stuff, like, will we see, like, in 20 years from now, will we see actually people out there, or it's all going to be robots and that's it?
Well, if you talk to the engineers, they would love it to be all robots. They would love that. They would say, if we had the budget of the human spaceflight programs at NASA for the last 20 years, we would have robots on every planet in the solar system. It wouldn't just be 2 rovers on Mars. They're quite sore about that. Yes, you could just send robots. It's tricky, isn't it? Because some people are very interested in robots. Most people are not. And when you have somebody looking at something and telling you about something, it's like why people climb Everest. You know, everyone like, oh, I look at a mountain, oh, it looks nice, you know. But there's a big difference between like, oh yeah, that's interesting, and someone coming back and be like, guess what I just did? I just climbed Everest, you know. Like, it's a totally different story. And like, we are storytellers and we are story listeners. That's how we learn about the world. And I genuinely think that if you just send robots and you never send people, you're missing so much of that. And I also don't think that if people don't see a pathway for themselves to achieve great things, follow in the footsteps of people, and just not motivated to do the things, you know, that make it great. I don't know. I think that's a huge thing.